Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Jason Stanley. He's the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. He's the author of 6 books, including How Fascism Works and How Propaganda Works. And he's a member of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School and serves on the advisory board of the Prison Policy Initiative. He writes frequently about authoritarianism, democracy, propaganda, free speech, and mass incarceration for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Project Syndicate, and many other publications. His new book, available now, is called Erasing History: How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. Jason, it's a pleasure to have you on, and thank you for being here.
Oh, it's great to be on.
Absolutely. And so, as we usually do, to start with a passage from Jason's book, he wrote, regardless of how it is led, a fascist culture or form of life often has certain features that make it an ideal environment for fascist politics. These cultures will, for instance, elevate an already dominant group of people to a mythic status, exalting them as the quote unquote the people who constitute the nation, while relegating others to second-class citizenship. From a fascist perspective, egalitarianism is a threat because it promises to upset this hierarchy. This threat is felt so acutely that fascists are led to take joy in cruelty against those outside a group and others who stand to benefit from greater equality. A fascist form of life is suffused with fear that others will achieve equal status, a possibility cynically exploited in fascist politics. A fascist form of life also has certain requirements. Perhaps most importantly, it requires an education system that can validate the dominant group's elevated status as a justified consequence of history rather than the fabricated result of intentional choices. It does this, as we will see, by selectively doctoring the historical record, erasing perspectives and events that are unflattering to the dominant group and replacing them with a unitary, simplified account that supports its ideological ends. So I'm sure, Jason, you've seen this was from a while ago, the movie Game Change with, so I'm bringing this up because I was actually watching it the other day. Remember the movie Game Change, the Julianne Moore movie where, what's his name? Ed Harris plays John McCain. So there was this really great scene in the movie, I remember. So there was a kind of an appeal at this point to populism. And I think the premise of the movie was that kind of Sarah Palin was the one who was getting the fascist ball rolling. Right. So, and there was, I remember, a pivotal moment in the movie where one of his aides or somebody or other asked John McCain, they said, listen, we could kind of really roll with this. Sarah Palin's becoming really popular. There's a pretty significant base out there for her, and we could kind of feed into this. And John McCain makes the statement, and this was so pivotal and poignant. He says something along the lines of like, look, there are politicians out there who love appealing to the baser instincts of populism. I'm not one of those people, and I'd like to stay that way. So, Jason, I now want you to take us back. So how did we get to this point where we had somebody like a John McCain who was a presidential candidate in 2008, and that was more or less the predominant view of republicanism, to where we are now, especially with somebody like Sarah Palin, and to some extent getting the ball rolling for that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's how do we get a far-right, anti-democratic, cult of the leader social movement in the United States? Partly, I think you have a charismatic leader. Fascism is about, centrally involves mass media, as Walter Benjamin emphasized, and Trump is a creature of television. And a creature of, sometimes that can work for you, like President Zelensky in Ukraine was a creature of television. But in this case, Trump's entire, that kind of worked out during wartime. In this case, the mass media creates this sort of image of someone as this super successful businessman and macho man, and then he gets billions and billions of dollars in free advertising. So obviously, I think there is a problem with the status quo. It is the case that there are these super rich cities and super rich people, and they many of whom support Trump, and elites here is bizarre because you have all these billionaires supporting Trump, and Trump is a billionaire. So but I think people are justly upset with a status quo of of inherited wealth, which was never meant to be part of a free market system. You can't have a free market with inherited wealth. So there's all these sort of structural problems. There's serious structural problems with American democracy. The Supreme Court gets in the way of student debt relief, so it's like impossible for people ever to, so there are these structural problems. Obviously, that's created in part by Trump himself, that particular thing. But I think people are frustrated with the status quo. And so in 2016, there were two ways out. There are always two ways out. There was Bernie Sanders and there was Trump. And it just wasn't going to be the case that people were going to go for another 4 years with a status quo politician. So it's always the case that in those circumstances, there's a reactionary revolution and there's a non-reactionary revolution. The interesting thing about this movement and the puzzling thing is that the material conditions for fascism haven't been met. It's not like, sure, the US had the Iraq War, but it wasn't like, it wasn't like people were like, oh, he should have won that war. It was more like, that was stupid. There wasn't a World War I event. There wasn't a Great Depression. So there are no communists in the United States. I guess I have a friend who was in the Spartacists in college, but she claims it was just because she wanted to date someone in the Spartacists. So, you don't have communists, so you kind of are left having to say that Kamala Harris is a communist, and Barack Obama, who had, the head of someone who became the head of Goldman Sachs as his Secretary of Treasury. This doesn't sound very Marxist to me. So you had to invent all this stuff. You had to invent, it's fascist politics. So you have to say that everyone who isn't your follower is a Marxist. But the Nazis actually faced the Bolsheviks, who were in fact sort of existential threat to religion, an existential threat to democracy. The Bolsheviks were there. The Clinton supporting mealy-mouthed liberals at Yale University are not Bolsheviks. So there's some mysteries. How are you able to construct things where there's no material basis? There's frustration with the status quo. There's which makes total sense. But you create an elite that has nothing to do, has little to do with the problems of the status quo, maybe something, and you call them Marxists, which is insane, like off the rocker. And why that works is a mystery.
Well, I'm sorry.
Actually, go.
And I just really want to add to that before you go into it. So there was a book that was written by a Harvard historian, Richard Pipes, which actually I really like, but this was the argument, since we're talking about it as a mystery. So he wrote, so it was called Communism: A History. It was about maybe a less than 200-page book. It was really good in terms of outlining the actual the satellite planets, the satellite countries of communism, how they were all related. But this was his argument. So his argument was, which, my God, the stretch here. But his argument was because liberals couldn't bring in communists to the US because there would be such a big revolution against it. And fundamentally, so the idea was that there would be so much backlash against it that these people would be essentially overthrown and beheaded, right? There would be a kind of secondary French Revolution here. So his argument was that the only thing that liberals could have done was brought in a communist light. And so his perspective was liberalism is literally just communist light. Like, that's it. That's all they did.
That is fascism.
Yeah, right.
The Hitler said the Social Democrats were communists, and they were the first people sent to the concentration camps. Anything that is democratic is communism. That's what we're hearing from the Republican Party. America was never a democracy. It was a republic, even though republic just is a kind of democracy. And so, the Republicans, the dominant ideology of MAGA republicanism now is that, either you slavishly follow Donald Trump and the far right and want a one-party state, like many states in the US now are, like in the South. North Carolina has gerrymandered a supermajority of Republicans, even though there are more registered Democrats than Republicans in North Carolina. So that's what they want. And anyone who's against permanent Republican rule, not just Republican rule, but permanent sort of MAGA Republican rule, is a communist. And and that's where we are. Why it works. I think one reason why it works is Black Lives Matter somewhat plays the role of communism in the political imaginary of the far right. So they can use the large Black Lives Matter protests, misrepresenting them as violent riots or whatever. They
Right.
can use, or they can use campus protests against Israel's actions in genocide, and Israel's actions in Gaza, genocidal actions in Gaza, and they can paint that as like communism and say, look, we're protecting you from that.
Right.
But there's no material reality there.
Yeah, it's not. Essentially, it's just manufactured, right, to
Yeah.
create like an in-group and out-group sort of mentality. I mean, it's fascinating to me. I mean, this might sound a little bit reductionist and a little bit also on the nose, but you would think that social media, right, in terms of how someone's algorithm is set up, the echo chambers that they're in, being inundated constantly by information. They don't have enough time to research everything. And so they kind of give way to authority essentially, and they'll take whatever information they're given as an authority, and then they're manipulated into following, you know, essentially fascist propaganda, right? And other forms of propaganda as well. But I mean,
Well, I think
yeah.
there is a kind of cult. There's a cult of the leader going on
Hmm.
now. So that's, like in any cult, that
Sure.
fascism with a cult of the leader works like that. I think you can have fascism without a cult of the leader, but Trump is playing a role like Mussolini or something. I mean, it's very, people just love him,
Right.
and so then I think, there was, Trump didn't introduce, but, was the very prominent purveyor of conspiracy theories from birtherism on.
Hmm.
And so this kind of breakdown of the uh, of respect for the media, which the media also has complicity in, but it leaves people not knowing not knowing where to look for information. Now, fascism always has a mass media part. I mean, the Nazis installed radios in
Right.
everyone's home. Hitler's speechifying was like Trump's, it's this weird thing about these guys, about all authoritarians, not just fascists, but also communist authoritarians like Castro. Um, they speak for hours. What is that about? Like, I can't figure that one out. Like, remember Bill Clinton's, you guys might be too young. Bill Clinton gave a 45-minute speech at the Democratic National Convention, and
Wow.
everyone just was like totally outraged at how long it was. It went on forever, and it was like this this mini scandal, and
Wow.
Trump just rattles on for 2 hours, and in incoherent ramble, and that's very similar. Hitler's speeches went on and on. I don't know what that's about, but there's a cult of the leader. I think there are also these different interests groups that are not tricked. They just have different interests and they're coalescing together. So the Christian nationalists, they're not tricked. They believe the earth is going to end soon. I guess that is itself a
Right.
conspiracy theory, but they're Christian nationalists. They want America to be a Christian country. They want everyone to be raised with the New Testament. And they're like, this guy's going to get it done for us. He transformed the Supreme Court into this. Uh, then there's the billionaires. The billionaires see the billionaires are essentially the monopoly capitalists of old. They think, okay, if this guy's in power and I'm a supporter, he'll tilt the market towards me. And Trump did a lot of that in his first term. He did a lot of paying companies back for not supporting him and doing favors. Look at what DeSantis is doing to Disney.
Mhm.
That's like a showing, really interfering in the business sphere. But it's also going to be interfering in the business sphere to help
Hmm.
companies who line up. That's what billionaires hope. And then Trump is promising to slash their tax. He gave them the biggest tax cut ever. He's promising to do much more of that. So the billionaires, they're not tricked. They're like, Peter Thiel, who's gay, is supporting anti-LGBTQ candidates.
Right.
Because he's just like, I'll just take these stupid homophobes. They're going to lower my taxes.
Yeah.
So, uh,
Yeah.
so there's these different interest groups, and then there's white nationalists. There's macho guys who are just like, Trump's cool because he was president, even though he like sexually assaulted lots of people.
Right. Yeah.
Mm.
And I think just going back to the John McCain quote where he mentioned tapping into the populism or the sort of sentiments of populism, right? I think it's really important to note that a lot of the times it's not so much that these, let's say, authoritarian strongman leaders, it's not as though they're the causes, right? There's this sort of there's this kind of context there that oftentimes goes unmentioned. And so when we think about fascism, right? So we mentioned Mussolini and you mentioned him as kind of playing a role, right? Playing the role of the strongman. So can you talk about some of the things, the sort of breeding ground for fascism, right? So essentially, again, so Trump, as McCain said, like Trump, somebody like a Trump, right, would tap into that. So what is it exactly that they're tapping into, right? And what are the breeding grounds for
So,
fascism?
so this is what I'm trying to address in erasing history, the breeding grounds. So it's standard in literature on fascism to talk about the material conditions for fascism, especially in the sort of Marxist perspectives.
Right.
I'm focusing, really focus on material conditions. It's funny because people are like, oh, the Marxists, but, they're worried about their paychecks and they're worried about, so it's like crazy. But, they should be Marxists if they're poor and, if they're working class and they're concerned about having a better life. But I'm focused on the ideological conditions for fascism. And what I'm concerned about is that the school system has the pre-existing school system has already set us up for to be conducive to fascism. As I talk about here, the Hitler in Mein Kampf says, you want a school system. He's like, we have forgotten, I forget, I have the quote in here. We have forgotten hold on, we have forgotten the method of education that we need, which is present the great men of the race, of the nation, in such a way as to make everyone honor and revere them. And then connect the nation to their identity as Aryans. So it looks a lot like here. Purpose of education is that you venerate the founders.
Right.
The founders were white men, and then you add on the kind of lie that they were devout Christians, and then then you set people up for like, oh my God, we're a nation on decline because you can't anymore say the United States is the greatest nation in human history. I mean, there's no such thing as the greatest nation in human history. So that's part of the background, so it's easy for someone then to come and say, oh, the nation is in decline, and in small literature on Nazi education, they make this point too. So that our pre-existing educational curriculum was also a kind of German supremacist nationalism. So going into the situation, we already have textbooks that, like the American Pageant textbook, which I discuss, one of the most widely used history textbooks. Until I believe 2001, it said that there were only 1 million indigenous people in North America when Columbus arrived, and that's off by a little bit. If you average out the most conservative estimates, which are 68 million, and the highs, which are 83 million, we can probably say it was somewhere in the 70 million, 72, 73 million range, right?
Wow.
So that's a bit off.
Mhm.
And if you're raised, and I went to school in the 80s, so there's a whole 15 years after I graduated high school where people were told that there was hardly anyone in North America. So with that kind of total misrepresentation of the past, people will get offended when they're being told things about, or Jim Crow or mass incarceration. They'll get offended because the education system hasn't prepared for them for that. And then, of course, with the worst assault on education in American history, a year or two ago, people were like, well, remember we had McCarthyism, but the attack on universities now is so much worse than then. That it's going to ensconce this view. The purpose of education is to make Americans think is to make Americans be proud of their country. You know, it's fine to be proud of your country. I'm proud of being American. But you know, that's not the purpose of a democratic education.
Right.
Right. No, we're definitely not angels. Like, for example, when you were talking about Columbus, I remember when I was taught in school. So I grew up in the 90s.
Right.
Literally, the image they painted of him is, he discovered America. He met the indigenous people, and they did some sort of treaties together. I'm going off of my memory of them, not the
Exactly.
actual.
So,
Yeah,
so
like, and everything was fine. He never killed anyone or raped anyone, and we celebrate him every year. He's a great man, and the president, our forefathers, none of them owned slaves. They were
right.
all benevolent, just really wise men,
Great, wise
Yeah.
men.
Yeah.
And the Nazis represented themselves as the Third Reich, as the inheritor of ancient Greece and Rome.
Right.
And that's what we're taught too, that the founders were the inheritors of Greece and Rome. So
Yeah.
the idea is there's this white civilization that goes back to ancient Greece, and we in the United States are the inheritors of that great white tradition. And all of that is what's the French nonsense.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. And can we also talk about, so on the one hand, right, there's because I want to get into some of the more emotional aspects of this. So in terms of history, right, and being taught history, learning it, etc. So we have on the one hand pride, but can we also now talk about how fear factors into teaching history as well?
Yes, brilliant. Well, so you have stereotypes that are, you know, what you want as an authoritarian is for people to be fearful of each other, for the dominant group to be fearful of everybody else, because then you can say, I'm going to protect you from them. So how do you, you know, I'm in New Haven, Connecticut. We have a neighborhood called Dixwell that's like 98, 99% Black.
Mhm.
And then we have a neighborhood, East Rock, that's like, you know, my kids are Black, and they were like, oh, there's another Black family somewhere like 5 blocks away. And uh, so how did we get here? How did we get to this place where there's militarized police guarding Black neighborhoods so that you can walk around in white neighborhoods? Now, obviously, it's because of structural racism. It's because Black people weren't essentially allowed to have homes for the most part because they didn't get federal housing loans until the 70s. And so you didn't inherit a house. And if you don't inherit a house from your parents, how the hell are you going to have any wealth?
Right.
You know, the wealth gap is larger now. I think it's larger now than it was like in the 60s. And so the schools, because we have local tax bases paying for schools, you know, you have large educational disparities because, you know, the prison system. So when I was born, there are more people serving life sentences now than were in prisons or jails when I was born.
Wow.
You know, these are shocking facts that, you know, you grow up with a parent in prison, obviously that's going to be difficult. And but if you don't learn about those things, if you don't learn about those structural things, then the stereotype that Black Americans are lazy, poor, and criminal will seem much more plausible to you because you won't have any other explanation. Like, how the hell can you just, like, when you're 12 years old or 13, 14, figure out that, you know, that whole parts of cities, like the Black neighborhoods, you couldn't get federal housing loans. So, you know, imagine buying a house without you know, so this is without, you know, where you have to pay more in interest because you have a high interest loan for your mortgage. So that allows stereotypes to fester, and that's what they want. They want those stereotypes to fester. So Trump can say, you know, Black majority cities are corrupt, you know, and say all the things he needs to say to get his big lie going. So you know, immigration obviously is the target of every fascist
Right.
movement in a country where there are immigrants. Obviously, Putin can't do that because who the hell wants to live in Russia? But
Alex
you
Jones does, apparently.
Right. Who does? Alex Jones?
Alex
Right.
Jones, yeah. So apparently now he says that there should be a mass migration to Russia, which is crazy because, 20 to even 10 years ago, everybody was anti-Russia because of communism. And now everybody's like, yeah, we love Putin now. Great. Okay. Now I can't make sense of whether you're on the right or whether you're pro-Russia. Okay, cool.
But yeah, Putin represents himself as the leader of the international anti-democratic far right, the international fascist movement,
Mhm.
and increasingly getting recognized as such.
Yeah.
So on the far right, he's a hero, and Viktor Orban, who doesn't throw his journalists out of windows, but makes sure that they face huge civil fines,
Yeah.
he's the hero of the mainstream right,
Yeah.
so immigration, great replacement theory is like the ideological core of fascism.
Mhm.
And so you make people fearful of the dominant group being replaced. And then fascism has different, it's not just it's also like, so here we have Christian nationalists who are multiracial, and they can be they're fearful of non-Christians coming in. And then white nationalists, many white Americans are afraid of the cultural being culturally and politically replaced by non-white people.
Right.
So that's a fear that is obviously at the very heart of the Trump campaign. The very heart of the Trump campaign is fear of Haitian immigrants.
Right. Yeah. And then so, when you look at it from a Marxist perspective, and I'm not necessarily going to kind of hyper focus on it, I'm just going to use this as a platform for what I want to say. So when you look at it from a Marxist perspective, I mean, the idea is it's a class war. I mean, fundamentally, there are people in the billionaire and billionaire class. Like these are the people who essentially dictate the rules. They make up our lives. They're the foundation for what we do, our day-to-days, our jobs, etc. Right. So how do you get to the point where we're blaming immigrants rather than, like, let's say Trump, who's right in front of us and who's, because I want to ask, I guess, several questions here, right? How do we get to that point where we're sort of allowing ourselves to redirect our focus onto these people, again, so we had Alice Driver on a couple of weeks ago, and she was, telling us the plight of people in, so Tyson Factory, what the immigrant situation was like there. And so the idea was like, I mean, these people have nothing, right? They have no political power whatsoever. They have no financial power. They have nothing. They have very few resources, right? So number one, how do we get from that point where we're pretty much just offloading the blame onto them? And then so number two essentially is like, fundamentally, why do we think that if we're kind of showing, or forget it, I lost point two. I'll come back to it.
No.
Yeah.
The rich versus, like, why aren't we directing our attention at
Right.
Right.
the rich, the elite?
No, but I had a second question. I lost it.
You're asking one of the most important questions that can be asked,
Right.
which is like, why do people act against their material interests?
Right. That's essentially
So
it.
now, so I'm not going to solve that because it is one of the central questions of the 20th century.
Mhm.
Du Bois's Black Reconstruction is all about this. Du Bois, shows that poor whites and poor Black people in the South were getting aligned with each other in a
Right.
labor movement. And so Northern industrialists, the end of Reconstruction, the 12-year period where Black people were allowed to vote and participate politically in the South, ended because, many poor whites refused to fight for enslavers, for plantation owners, like in the South. Like this idea that poor whites were fighting in the Confederate Army en masse is false. So it was very clear at the time what they were fighting for. They were fighting for people who owned plantations. And so Du Bois says that this growing labor movement connecting poor whites and poor Blacks was an obvious threat to Northern industrialists. So Northern industrialists joined with the planter class to give poor whites a slight leg up over poor Black people, and then use white nationalism as a way to bring them in along on the side
Right.
of the same wealthy people who are exploiting them. And so this is the dominant story of fascism, that's what you do. Hitler hates labor unions because he says labor unions bring together people on the basis of class.
Right.
I was talking to an organizer, an old school organizer for the AFL-CIO, who told me she was organizing in one of these like all these southern racist states are also anti-union. So she was organizing in some southern state, I forgot where it was, which is very difficult work to do in those states. And she said, yeah, I would go, there would be black workers, a lot of them, and then I'd go into, an apartment of a white worker and there'd be a Confederate flag hanging on the wall.
Right.
But in the union meeting, they were all angry at the boss and working together. And so unions are always the target of fascist. Trade unionists were also among the first targets of the Nazis. So unions have had a lot of problems, but they have, they gave us the weekend, they gave us the 8-hour workday.
Yeah.
And so, those are some cool things. And there are places, and the people are right, the fascists are right, and the neo-fascists, that they bring people together across racial lines. And, everybody is in the, if in the, everyone's supposed to be in the union. If you're a worker, you're together with other workers. So it's always been the case that, Du Bois is very good on this, that, I mean, that's one of the classical works on the question you ask. I mean, it's not like he solves it, but he's pointing out that white nationalism is just a way to bust up labor unions.
Yeah, so now I actually remembered my second question, but I think you pretty much answered it, give or take. So my second question was going to be, do you think that it's actually all of these arguments are done in bad faith? That there's this sense that, like, okay, yeah, we kind of know that it's not the immigrants, but like maybe Trump will trickle down some of those crumbs for us. Like if we just support him and we show him enough love, attention, whatever, that essentially he'll take care of us. So it's kind of like they know, but they're not willing to admit it.
Well, the wealthy, the billionaire class, who's largely supporting Trump, knows that it's not immigrants, and they're just doing what Thiel is doing, like taking advantage of these poor rubes who are taken in by white nationalism to get their taxes cut.
Yeah.
But I don't think that I think there's genuine fear when you're a working class member of a dominant group of losing your social status. And think of men's rights movements. That's a clear instance of people worrying that they're going to lose their status as men.
Right.
Which is not to say there aren't like arguments about differences in imprisonment and stuff like that, but it's just to say we're all familiar with certain aspects of men's rights movements that are clearly driven by resentment.
Yeah.
So being driven by resentment, great replacement theory, we know from social psychology that great replacement theory makes people irrational. It changes their politics. My colleague Jennifer Richardson in 2014 did an experiment that showed if you prime people by saying that in 2042 America will be majority minority, they become much more right wing on a whole host of questions, including they become more skeptical about climate change.
Right.
So it's a weird thing, people, if you amp great replacement theory up using the school system, for instance, saying look at the glory of white Christianity, then you're going to have a more reactionary electorate that is going to be responsive, particularly to immigration, which was I mean, look at Hitler's conspiracy theory in Mein Kampf. It's worth dwelling on it. The very specific theory. People don't know this. Lots of people don't know this. It was that the Jews betrayed Germany in World War I so that Germany lost the war in order to bring in in order to bring the French army into the Rhineland, and the black Senegalese soldiers, in particular the black Senegalese soldiers, into the Rhineland to breed with German good Aryan women with the goal of undermining the white race.
Yeah.
Now, each step in that conspiracy theory is called the Black Horror on the Rhine. each step in that conspiracy theory is completely untethered from reality, beginning with the Jews betrayed Germany in World War I, and then on to, and they did it in order to bring in Senegalese soldiers into the Rhineland. But Hitler in Mein Kampf, chapter 2, is about Vienna and fascist ideology. Cities are dangerous, filled with immigrants and homosexuality, and they're dirty. And this is all chapter 2 of Mein Kampf, my study and struggles in Vienna. Foreign languages everywhere. So, this stoking of fear. I mean, there's kind of a meme on social media, right, of like, posting like ridiculous pictures from science fiction movies about New York City with like destroyed rubble everywhere, like get near, because people are like, I'm too scared to go to New York City, which is safer than any big city in the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm actually curious, in terms of like combating fascist propaganda, how can we sort of use like classical education to combat it, or what can we use for ourselves?
So classical education, I have a chapter about classical
Right.
education, as you know, in the book. It's being used cynically and hypocritically and absurdly by the far right. They want to reinstate classical education, but what that often means is Christian nationalism.
Right.
And they spread this idea that, progressives and are Marxists who want to undermine the nuclear family, so we need classical education, which tells us to come to Jesus and support the nuclear family, which is all utter bollocks, because Plato in the Republic urges, in his ideal city, all children are taken away from their parents at birth and raised by the state. That is classical education. Classical education is very radical, can be very radical. So the whole use of classical education as this sort of war against progressive education is nonsensical, and it's really just a mask to bring in Christian nationalism. But as I argue, there are radical elements in classical education. Martin Luther King, in his social and political philosophy class at Boston University, the final exam, one of the questions is list the radical ideas in Plato's Republic. But I think that we have to pay attention to the fact that every fascist regime promotes classical education. So Hitler promoted, and not for the ideas. It's rather because of this idea that whiteness can be read backwards. So, I mean, the classical fascist, like Italy and Germany. So the idea was, these civilizations are the inheritors of Greece and Rome. And there was a mythic white race that goes backwards. And so that's very often how classical education is used. Personalist use of classical education. That's how classical education is invoked in the United States. And I think that's very dangerous. So we do need, I mean, Toni Morrison won a goddamn Nobel Prize in Literature. I mean, if that's not canonical, if her works are not canonical American literature, there's no such thing as canonical American literature. So she won the Nobel Prize. That's hard to do. And nobody, like the people electing the Nobel Prize for literature, are not woke. They're looking at the writing, and they're international, so there's no reason to single out an American, except Toni Morrison is one of the greatest American writers ever, and banning her books is the most canonical, it's the most regressive thing you can do. Her books are being banned everywhere. I mean, this is just the point that if you care about great literature, that's not what's going on now on the right. The right don't care about great literature. They care about banning Black authors and declaring their work obscene, like the Nazis banned Jewish authors and declared their work obscene. So the educational, so it's always been the case that that education is progressive education attempts to, telling everyone about the history of all the different groups in their nation, so they understand people's perspectives, and stereotypes are punctured. Stereotypes, you no longer tempted by stereotypes, and so you don't have fear of each other. That's always been democratically central. So, in this book, what I'm doing is I'm trying to address the puzzle. Why is one of their primary and first targets schools and universities?
Right.
Right. Yeah.
We know about the press, we know about courts, but schools and universities are under discussed, and explaining why involves talking about democratic education and how democratic education does inure you to authoritarianism to some extent.
Right. Yeah, and then again, going back to the education system of I guess, fascist regimes, again, and even going back and tagging for my question earlier, how much do these people actually know, right? Like, how much is it that they know that it's fear, and how much is it that they know that, let's say, that they're stoking fear, that it's manipulative, and how much are they really afraid? This was a question that I always had about the Nazi regime, because the Jews were obviously always throughout history a very small population. So, and I always wondered, like, how much did the Nazis actually conceive of Jewish people and, other minority groups as obviously threats? And how much was it just a manipulation tactic? And also, again, going back to just a regular person, like, how much do they actually believe that immigrants are taking over, and how much do they just kind of use it more or less, to kind of kiss up to the authority figures or whatever, right? So, and the reason why I think that question is so important, because it really tells us or informs how we should tackle it. Because if it is manipulative, right, if we are dealing with high level narcissism, let's say, not for regular people, obviously, but I mean, even to some extent, it would be the case, but like for mostly with authoritarian figures and for people within their sphere, it would really tell us or inform how we should deal with it, right? Because if you have people who are just more or less delusional, I would think that that's much easier to deal with than people who are actually just actively manipulative. Because then I would argue that if you're dealing with somebody who knows what they're doing, obviously it's kind of a lost cause.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think it's a mixture, honestly. I think it is a real thing. People, if you're low down on the socioeconomic ladder, being frightened about losing even that position.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it all goes back, as you said, to redirecting blame from billionaires and corporations to people you target, to to scapegoats. And Jews were a handy scapegoat for the Nazis, because precisely because they were such a small population. And it wasn't religious Jews who were their ideological and propaganda targets. It was me. It was the Jews who fit in, who are assimilated, who are part of the culture, those were the Marxists controlling the universities and the press. It wasn't Orthodox Jews. Hitler's not railing against Orthodox Jews in Mein Kampf. He's railing against supposed, like communist Jews who control the media and the theater and are making and have invented LGBTQ ideas and are behind feminism. That's not Orthodox Jews. So it's like, Hitler's saying, oh, among you are these people who claim to be German, and they fit in and they go to your parties, and they're part of your companies. They're the directors of your theaters, and you might not recognize them, but they really are a race who is trying to destroy the Aryan race.
Mhm.
That's why they're fitting in and assimilating. So that's also why LGBTQ people are a useful scapegoat, right? Because they too are small, especially trans people are a very small population that you can raise fear and panic about. So scapegoats are necessary for this kind of question. And really what you're asking is why do scapegoats work?
Yeah, that's it.
And that is a profound philosophical question. People like Peter Thiel know that they work because Peter Thiel's favorite thinker is Rene Girard, who writes just about scapegoats. So Peter Thiel knows on an intellectual level what he's doing. He like goes to Girard conferences. So Girard isn't necessarily recommending scapegoats. He's just talking about that structure. But there's a lot of people who know that scapegoats work. And obviously, Ron DeSantis knows there's no voter fraud.
Hmm.
Obviously, he went to Yale and then Harvard. I mean, there's like no voter fraud. 0.00005% of elections in the United States in the local and national level have experienced any voter fraud at all.
Right.
And so there's no voter fraud. So think about that. Think about that. It's the center of the Republican Party. It's like saying we've got to deal with the problem of magic pink bunnies in living rooms.
Mhm.
And so someone like Ron DeSantis, Ted Cruz, JD Vance, they know all of this. Like JD Vance in his interview with his friend Ross Douthat in the New York Times giving a giant column to the vice presidential candidate, lauding him and just talking about, the New York Times is deeply implicated in what we're seeing by, normalizing everything and treating it like a horse race and, natalism again and again in their op-ed section. We have to have more babies. And so JD Vance went on and on about how he believed that the 2020 election was fraudulent. This is a Yale law grad. He's married to a Yale law grad. His kids are going to go to Yale. Everyone at Yale loves him. He knows exactly what he's doing. So all these guys like Ron DeSantis before the 2022 midterms, with his stupid electoral fraud office, they're arrested 20 people for supposedly, not, they were having criminal records and voting anyway, 13 of whom I think were black, and then put the videos everywhere on social media of these black Florida citizens being arrested for like being told that they weren't allowed to vote and because of criminal convictions. And so that obviously tamps down the votes in minority populations. So all these politicians know exactly what they're doing. They're just out to destroy democracy and profit off of it. But do their followers know that? Some do. The billionaires obviously do. The ones chuckling about it all. Other people, I think, just think, okay, we want a society in which the poor get crushed. And, Jonathan Metzl has this book, Dying of Whiteness, which is about all the states that deny federal funding for Medicaid, turning down, hundreds of millions of dollars for their poor citizens, almost all of whom are white. Like Kentucky, West Virginia, these are states turning down federal Medicaid aid. And you ask people in those states who would need Medicaid, would need this money, need this health insurance. They say, well, they don't want the undeserved to get it,
Wow.
by which they mean non-white, black people, obviously. So, the questions you've been asking me is why does that work? And those are, incredibly difficult philosophical questions. It's really the question of ideology, right? Spinoza formulates it as, talking about kings. Why do so many men willingly die so that one man may boast?
Right.
So you're asking about the question of ideology, and we haven't solved that. But in this book, what I'm doing is I'm saying the education system has a large role to play,
Right.
both in fighting the ideologies that counter our material interests, and or if they're taken over, in building up these ideologies so we serve the billionaire class even more.
Right. And then, so going back into sort of the breeding ground of it, right? So we covered some elements of it, but another important element is how fascists tend to be the dictators, or authoritarians, how they tend to be opportunists. So for anybody who knows anything about the history of, let's say, Vladimir Putin, for instance. So what was interesting about him is at the time, So oligarchy was pretty much the prominent form of government, if you want to call it that, in Russia. Whether it was a government or not is debatable. But the idea was that many of these people, so Boris Berezovsky was the most prominent one at the time. I mean, these were people that were bleeding the country. And then here comes Putin, and he says, you know what? I'm going to kill the oligarchs. You know, it's a corrupt system. You know, I'm going to, I'm quoting Trump now, drain the swamp. You know, so can we talk about that, right? So can we talk about, since we are on the sort of topic of like these grassroots movements of you know, impoverished people suffering, feeling like, okay, the system is corrupt, it's not working for them, etc., how these opportunities come about, and essentially how they start to tackle what are legitimate problems, right? So because at the time of Putin, when he was coming up, I mean, there was the significant problem of oligarchy, and essentially he did strip them of their power, you know, to whatever extent. I mean, a lot of them came to work for him, and he was like, all right, I'll let you guys keep some resources, but for the most part, you're selling most of them to me, you're selling them to the state, which was really like him and his friends. But the idea is that they tackle, or try to tackle, you know, try sort of quote unquote here, right? So they try to tackle significant problems. But can we talk about essentially how they take these opportunities, and how essentially there is a lot of times this fundamental corruption that exists, that, you know, to quote William Blake, what ends up happening is the iron fist that crushed the tyrant's head became a tyrant in its stead.
Right. So that's why it's very important not to have such a corrupt status quo, because you, as we do in the United States, we have a corrupt status quo. So when you do that, then you allow someone even more corrupt to come and say, you know, like Trump positioned himself. He's like, I know all about corruption. So you need me as president because I know about how this all works.
Yeah.
And then he comes in and he makes it like, you know, his first term was kind of hilarious. The level of open corruption, the Trump Hotel, you know, the using the article in the New York Times today about how the Justice Department did go after his enemies.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, so it was like so open, you know, like Kushner, Jared Kushner getting these huge contracts from Saudi Arabia, from, I forget what, but, you know, I think Saudi Arabia, and, you know, it was so open and naked, you know. It's like the difference was, it was like, you know, it grew, it was much more dramatic, the level of corruption, and it was much more open under Trump. And now Trump is like just openly promising billionaires that, you know, you line up with me like Musk, you know, I'll do these favors for you.
Yeah.
I'm going to cut your taxes. I'm going to be. So again, you're asking a question of ideology. How the hell does that work? Why do people then support such a person? Maybe, you know, and I have strong views on this, but it's a question that will never go away. People, you know, monarchy was an ideology, right?
Yeah.
Why did so many people, you know, glorify their king who took everything? I think the Russia case is it's an extreme version of what's happening in the United States. And happening in the United States, you have a deeply problematic status quo. It's very hard. Social mobility is extremely difficult. In Russia, the end of the Soviet Union led to some of the worst years ever. You know, millions and millions of people died during the 1990s.
Right.
And that was caused by capitalism.
Mhm.
You know, so it was a kind of mad cowboy capitalism that the West introduced and imposed. And, you know, suddenly people's pensions disappeared and they just died. And so, you know, and then the West equated capitalism with democracy.
Yeah.
So they were like, oh yeah, free markets, that's democracy. So no wonder people were like, you know, fuck democracy. You know.
Right. Yeah, and I like your comparison to the Wild West, because that's essentially what happened with the oligarchs. I mean, these were people who already started out with a ton of money, because from like the leftovers of communism at the time. And then so what they did was they just bought up all the resources. I mean, and a lot of it was, when they bought them up, I mean, it was through nefarious means. It wasn't that they just like, there was like, you know, some bidding out there or whatever. No, they essentially extracted resources because they had the power to. So what's so interesting about that is, in some ways, I guess you had these, and it was said that there was like the first time in Russian recent history, that they had like multi-billionaires, which never existed in the country before them, besides like, the SARS regimes. So with that being said, this was looked on as such a great thing. They're like, look, we have so much prosperity. But no, it really wasn't that. There was literally no prosperity in Russia at the time. Boris Yeltsin was horrendous. And so what you literally had was you had these few people who were super rich who controlled all the resources. And it was essentially not communism in the way that we think of it. It wasn't Marxist communism, but it was the version of communism that literally existed in a capitalist form.
It wasn't communism. It was kleptocracy.
Yeah, right.
Complete, because, communism, everyone is kind of, under the kind of communist systems, I mean, Marxism is not really a thing. It's more like an attitude, like
Right.
give materialist explanations, it's really people's income, wealth that drives their attitudes and stuff like this. So, Marx underestimated the role, the power of nationalism, of ideologies that went against people's material interests. But so Marxism is like kind of more of an attitude than a view about the future. But these communist systems in like, for instance, the Soviet Union, they, people weren't dying of starvation. I mean, obviously Stalin starved 2 millions of Ukrainians, so they weren't, in the Gulag, people are dying of starvation. But in the 70s, like, people were miserable, but the level of misery was not like, starving to death.
Right.
It's kind of like life kind of sucked for everybody. And then in the 90s, you just had this, it says an extreme version of the United States. Like, my kids like to be in Western Europe because there's not like people lying on the sidewalks. Like, my whole life, the United States has been characterized by, essentially slums of homeless people.
Right.
But Russia in the 90s took that to such extremes. I mean, look at this photo I have on my wall by the Russian photographer Alexei Titarenko of Leningrad in 2000. Leningrad in 1994. It's a Leningrad famine. So this is a man selling one record,
Wow.
two empty bottles, and a shoe. So, Russia experienced a situation. The United States is a situation where we just have, people. The other day I was, like New Haven, everywhere in the United States, there's like, such intense poverty. And Russia was just like, so in that situation, I guess those are great inequality. So, I mean, that's classical democratic political theory, that great inequality is incompatible with democracy for the
Right. Yeah. And so as we start wrapping up, I do want to ask you one of our final questions, and Jason. So, okay. So now that we're thinking about it in terms of systemic corruption, the difficulties actually going on in our country, right? So what would you tell, specifically, I want to address this to liberals and Democrats, right? So we tend to, I know you mentioned this before, this is why I'm really asking. So you mentioned this in terms of like the fractions, right? And the factions and the fact that we're so fractured. So I want to start thinking about it in terms of like, how do we address Democrats? Because on the one hand, right, what we tend to do, and I'm guilty of this too to some extent, we're like pretty pro Kamala, we don't really like to say anything negative about the system. We don't like to talk about like her specific endorsements. With Hillary Clinton, nobody really wanted to address her speaking fees for Goldman Sachs and other banks, right?
I did.
I hear you. I'm sure you were one of the few, right? So because at this point, for us, I think we're so terrified of there being another Trump presidency, and we're just terrified of any Republican candidate, truthfully, right? So we tend to be like pretty zeroed in on the Democrats, and we're like, home team, like that's kind of our mentality, right? So how would you address Democrats, especially again going back to this breeding ground and this context for fascism, knowing again, if on the one hand we do have a ton of corruption and severe systemic issues, right? And then on the other hand, what happens is for a lot of people, they're like, hey, if you keep denying it, we'll find their own ways to address it. So how do we now address liberals and Democrats who again tend to pretend as though it doesn't exist, that fundamentally whoever our candidate is going to solve, I would even say, non-existing problems?
Right. We need fundamental structural change to deal with these enormous problems of inequality. Being the wealthiest country on, like you said, like Russia in the 90s, and by some ways we're the wealthiest country in the world, and by other ways, like, Austria, is not like, there's a basic, you can leave your home, you can,
Mhm.
the state will support you. Germany, all these European countries, the state will pay for you. So, you can take a year off and the state will pay for you. You'll have your health insurance, So we have sort of this brutal system. And it's tilted towards the children of the wealthy. Uh, and uh, and that's obvious. So we have to change that, or else we will face this again and again and again. And with Clinton, I mean, I voted for Hillary Clinton in the end, though I was a Sanders supporter.
Yep.
Uh, uh, with Clinton, we really faced that. She really, exemplified the problems of the status quo. She's promising, she's telling, audiences in, rural Michigan that, she's going to have their kids learn about tech so they can be, work for Google. Like, whereas Trump was like, I'm going to bring manufacturing back so you can have the lives that your parents did. Now, he totally cynical and he didn't do that. And, and what gave people those good lives in Michigan were the unions. The unions meant that, you could work in an auto factory and have a little boat that you took, that you went fishing with, a little motorboat and a pickup truck. You could drive it on, and people lived nice middle class lives because of unions.
Right.
What Trump did is he promised that life back, whereas Hillary Clinton essentially, lectured them about, like as the Johnson administration did with Black Americans, you need to learn how to act white. And we must deal with those structural problems, or we will face someone like Trump or even worse.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And Hillary Clinton, it's like the idea to tell people like, hey, you just need more education is so first of all, like the education systems in these rural places are already not that great. So it's kind of like up to the federal government in some sense to intervene, number one. And number two is like, how absurd is it to think like that regular people living, I don't know, working even in McDonald's shouldn't be able to like live a middle class life. Like, I
Exactly.
don't even understand that. Like, why is it that they have to work at Google? Like, duh.
Right. Exactly. So, and Trump got that, but it was fake because his real thing was enriching himself and his billionaire friends.
Right. Right. All right. So as we wrap up, Alan, final questions for Jason before we go.
Yes, if we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
Well, I just go to your local independent bookstore and ask them to order it, because this is a pretty existential time for independent bookstores. Uh,
Absolutely.
I don't really use social media anymore. So there's no way to follow me that way. Uh, I guess I publish op-eds regularly. I put my thoughts into my books and articles. So, if you can, I write for The Guardian.
Yeah,
Uh,
I just read your article on the Bangladesh uprising. Yeah.
yeah. But I don't use social media because X is owned by Elon Musk. Facebook is owned by Mark Zuckerberg. So I just don't, I try to avoid. I'm on Instagram, but I use it to post pictures of the back of my kids' heads when they're playing basketball.
No photos
Right
of
there.
no revolutionary photos.
Yeah, no, very, very few revolutionary photos. Although I take my kids along to my talks. I'm a half-time single dad, so I just have to, if I'm giving a revolutionary talk, they just have to come with me. So they're often in those circumstances. They've seen people disrupt my talks, things like that.
Hmm.
So they're used to that. But yeah, so follow me. I don't really necessarily want to be followed.
Fair. That's fair. Yeah.
So
Wait, you don't want the KGB stalking you?
right. I don't want to be followed. I think that whole idea of being followed is something I don't want.
I hear you.
No, it's
You know,
fair.
there's no privacy then, and social media is itself an oppressive structure
Mhm.
that makes us behave in a way where they're always being watched. So who wants that? That's like authoritarianism, right? If you're always being watched.
I hear you. Jason, thank you so much for coming on.
It was a
This
pleasure.
was incredibly insightful.
A really great discussion. Thank you.
Absolutely. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
All right. That was awesome. So, everyone, if you'd like to follow us, of course, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
Hit the bell on YouTube.
And again, thank you so much for watching and see you next time.